Welcome to a new season of The Conversation. I am Kwame Thomas, and set with me today is Mr. Kenyatta Powell, attorney at law and a director at the Jamaicans for Justice. Welcome, Mr. Powell. How are you?
I'm welcome, and I'm glad to be here with you.
So, a lot has been happening on the landscape. Jamaica has, well, we're never void of stories and we're never void of concerns. But one of the things that I'd like to speak to you quickly about is the whole issue of the Integrity Commission's anti-corruption efforts. And I wanted to find out about a new proposal that was made to stagger filing intervals, particularly for groups like police officers, to reduce the backlog. Could you tell me about the practical benefits of this approach and its potential impact on
well, the practical benefits would be right there in the way you asked the question. Because it appears to me and others that one of the things that's affecting the Integrity Commission would be the issue of, how much resources it has to actually do the job. And so right now there are several categories of people who need to make these annual integrity filings. And some of those categories are large. So for instance, if you think about categories involving police officers, right? I think we're up to what now? 13,000, 14,000 police officers. There are other large categories of public sector workers who need to file. And so that if you have a system where the commission does have limited resources, if you could stagger when certain groups of people are required to file so that it gives the commission time to assess those filings before it has to go to another group, I think that could help. I also think that what could help is maybe we don't need, for instance, to have a teacher at a primary school having to do the same kind of filing or even any filing at all with the Integrity Commission. So one of the things we can do is to, again, go back and look at the categories of persons and ask ourselves, do we really need some of these categories? Or we could consider a threshold so that if you're not a person working for the state earning above a certain amount a year, maybe you are exempt from integrity filings.
So do you foresee any broader policy implications there in terms of how this approach might influence the Commission's overall strategy as far as corruption is concerned?
I can't speak for the Commission, obviously. But what I've seen from the Commission is that I think the Commission is dedicated. The commissioners and the people who are employed at the commission are dedicated to the job that they've been hired and empowered to do. And I expect that to continue going forward, whichever approach we go with. And I think the commitment of the commission, and sometimes the steadfast commitment of the commission, is probably one of the things that's got it into some kind of friction with the political directorate. So from the position of the commission, from what I've seen, and again, I'm not speaking for them, they will remain committed to the job.
Okay, so are there any insights, perhaps, that you might be able to provide into any specific areas that where additional resources, whether personal or other, that you think might be crucial to their effectiveness?
Again, my assessment that there might be resource issues with the commission is that assessment is based on a general view of, whether certain systems and institutions in this country are properly resourced and properly funded. So what I'm saying is that I don't know specifically what's going on in the commission itself. It's just my feeling from some of the things that have been said that they might not have all that they need.
Okay, all right. Tell us a little about the public perception of changes. So we hear about the changes to the filing intervals. You have spoken about it times before now. And where I'm thinking that it actually could impact the public perception. So how might we anticipate the public's reaction to these proposed changes? What steps could be taken to ensure that transparency and understanding is actually there?
Take the first part of the question. I don't get the impression from talking to people in the public that the public has a negative perception of the Integrity Commission. I think for most people who are paying attention, I think most people think that the Integrity Commission does a very important job because corruption is a serious issue in Jamaica, and I think most people are appreciative of the work that that the Commission does. I'm going to say something a little controversial. I think that in terms of certain changes, and especially if we're dealing with who needs to file, I think those changes are likely to affect public perception if the public, in a negative way, if the public thinks that the political leaders, right, or parliamentarians are trying to give themselves a break, or trying to give themselves, you know, an easier time with it. So I think so long as we're not in a position where it looks like that's what's happening, I'm not, generally I don't think that there should be a bad public reaction to it.
Oh, well, following up on this question though, I'm thinking that, and especially when you spoke about the threshold, them having a threshold, I'm wondering though if this threshold is lowered and it reduces the number of public servants that are required to file and so on, how do you envision the maintenance of collaboration and ensuring that the Commission's access to crucial information from public servants is continued? Do you think that might be an hindrance?
No, I don't think so, because you would still keep intact the Commission's power and ability to ask for further questions, to ask to be furnished further information, to ask for explanations. Right? So I think even if you, what I'm saying is that it really is a practical consideration for me if, and the example I brought up, does a teacher at a primary school really need to be filing the same integrity forms and assessments as somebody who, I don't know, is probably in charge of a large state agency? I'm not talking about, I don't think this proposal is about altering the Commission's power to do actual deep investigative work. So I think the Commission should still be in a position to ask the questions it needs to ask, to call upon other entities within the public sector to assist them in its work. So I don't envision that should be a problem.
Okay, well, and the issue of balancing efficiency and oversight, though, the director, Beresford, he proposed lowering the filing threshold to something like 12 million or so. Do you see...
mean elevating?
Well, yeah. It's to put it there. So do you see there being a balance between improving efficiency and ensuring, say, effective oversight? Because we tend at times to have an issue with oversight, sometimes.
Yes, we tend to have an issue with oversight, but I think maybe what the director was going at is we have to consider if overkill is the way to go, right? And so if we have a system where just anybody who has done any work for the state is somehow caught and must now be doing all of these filings, I mean, you have to ask yourself, is that a healthy system to have? I don't think it is. And I'm one of the biggest proponents you will find of making sure something like the Integrity Commission is properly empowered and staffed and independent so that it can vigorously do its work. But I don't think oversight, overkill is the way to go.
So, well, that question is based on, we have a tendency to err on the side of caution. So that's primarily why that question came about. But your solution seemed to be hinting at building our capacity.
Yes.
You know, so could you share any specific recommendations for addressing any potential under-resource or resource gaps rather, and how might you see these changes?
Again, I will say I don't know. It's the feeling, the inclination I have just from the outside, looking in. So I think that this specific question is probably best posed to somebody from the Commission if they're minded. Yeah, they're minded to answer.
So, tell me now about, a state of emergency has been imposed.
Yes, I know.
And it's almost over now.
Yes, it's almost over.
Yes. And you have mentioned a number of times that most citizens have been influenced, if that's the right term, influenced by the government to believe that the level of criminal violence constitutes an emergency. Could you elaborate on the factors that would contribute to this perception?
Yes, and I think this discussion is extremely important. So we've reached a point in this country where I think we are having, at one level, a disagreement about words and what they mean. So I think when people hear somebody like me say that crime doesn't constitute an emergency, I think that translates to a lot of people to mean Kenyatta is saying that crime is not a concern, or that it's not a grave concern, or that it's not serious, or that it's not a bad thing. That's precisely not what I'm saying. So again, I always say we have to be clear about what clear and precise about what we're doing and what we're talking about. So the sense of the meaning of the word emergency is something that is sudden, unexpected, right? And the very nature of an emergency is something that you are not given an opportunity to plan for in the way you're going to respond. Crime in Jamaica is terrible. It's scary, right? I mean, I'm out there, and when I speak to people, I can hear from them their own level of feeling insecure in Jamaica. And I live in this country, right? My family lives in this country. My niece, who I talk about a lot, who I take care of, is a young woman, a teenager in this country. I fear when she goes off to school. So we're not talking about the idea that crime is not bad. What we're talking about is the fact that this crime situation we have in Jamaica, it's chronic. It's not something that just happened the other day. And so for chronic society-wide problems, right, you don't need emergency powers to deal with those. You need a concrete national society-wide plan as to how we fix the problems in Jamaica that's leading to the kind of crime that we have.
All right, let me hold you on that thought. We'll be right back. You are watching The Conversation. I am Kwame Thomas. Welcome back to The Conversation. Just before the break, we started looking at, well, how you feel, or how you felt rather, about the government and how they communicated around the state of emergency. But could you tell us what were some of the factors that the government has used, or some of the ways that the government has influenced public opinion into thinking that way?
So I think it's important to for us to understand what precisely the disagreement that some of us in the human rights advocacy community are having with the government, right? Essentially what the government wants to do is that it wants to use certain powers in the Constitution, the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, and those are emergency powers. And what emergency powers, the meat of emergency powers is what they allow you to do, is that they allow you to detain people without charging them for indefinite periods, or rather for the period of the emergency. Right? And that is obviously a serious radical derogation, a radical abrogation of people's constitutional rights. So the government wants to use those powers, and we've seen the government use those powers because between late 2017, 2018 into 2019, we had rolling states of emergencies in places like St. James. And one of the things the government used those powers to do was to detain people. If you look at the petitioners in the Everton Douglas case, for instance, one of them was detained for 430 days without being charged with an offense. And that person was detained, held for that long period of time, pursuant to the government using these emergency powers. So the disagreement that some of us in the human rights community are having with the government is that we are saying that those kinds of derogations, abrogations of rights are clear violations, and we shouldn't have those. So what has happened is the government, I think, because it feels, and I will grant the politicians the grace, I will grant that they actually legitimately, in good faith, think that they really can't do anything without these powers, right? But I think in pursuance of getting these powers and exercising them over a very long period of time, the government has engaged in clear propaganda about what a state of emergency is. So, what happens when a state of emergency is declared and it expires is that you see, people can physically see the security forces leaving the area, right? They can see the checkpoints being pulled apart and people leaving. And so the idea it creates, that alone creates in people's minds is that the government cannot deploy increases in security manpower without the powers of a state of emergency. And I'm telling you that in law, that is simply not the case. Under ordinary law in Jamaica, they can actually deploy the army. You can have cordons and checkpoints and curfews and all of that. You actually don't need emergency powers to do any of that. So, but again, I think it's obvious to somebody like me that the government has decided that it really needs the ability to be able to lock up some people, either permanently or semi-permanently, in order to get the crime situation under control.
So couldn't we say, isn't the government acting based on recommendations that have been put forward by the security forces?
Except though that this is a democracy, or rather this is supposed to be a democracy, right? And
why the change in the statement? why the change in the statement?
I have some criticisms I have to tell you about whether we do actually have a true democracy. I know we have regular general elections, around about every 4 years or so, and we've had peaceful transfers of governmental power from one political party to the next. But I think other than the fact that we vote in a general election every 4 or so years, there is no deeper democratic consultation or democratic contact with the government.
So you're saying
so we elect a government and them just do what they want to do for however long. They feel no need to consult us in between the election process. They regularly take decisions against the public will and on and on. And that's just a side effect, I think, of the sort of governmental system that we have.
So could you then, is it right to assume, based on what you have said, that we have been left out of pretty much most of the democratic process? That's what you're saying.
Of course, we've been left out of most of the democratic process. I'll give you an example. Not a pet peeve of mine is we are talking about seriously altering our constitutional system, transforming Jamaica into a republic, possible changes to other aspects of the governmental system. And the way our government has decided to go about it is to set up an exclusive constitutional reform committee that meets away from the public, that, maybe we've got some meeting minutes out of them, but not many, and all of that. And you don't have a lot of deep public consultation about what the Constitution of Jamaica should look like. Our Constitution is about you and me and every Jamaican, so we should have an input in it. And what's happening is that the government is set up a constitutional reform committee and an approach to it, right, that seems hostile to the idea that ordinary Jamaicans are to be brought into the constitutional making and reform process.
But to your point, though, why would you call it exclusive? Because last time we checked, there were representatives. Aren't there representatives of each faction? That's my question to you.
You elected any of those representatives? I'm told that there's a youth representative on the committee. All right? A youth representative. And it's somebody I know, right? Somebody I know, I should say that. And that she's a nice enough, decent enough young man, right? But no person in the constituency that he is supposed to represent had any say at all in his appointment to the committee. So how is he representative of youths, however you define that, in Jamaica, if no youth had a say in him being appointed. He was selected. He essentially was selected by the Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs.
So I'm trying to understand your issue though. Is it that your issue is with the selection of the particular individuals or how the process is handled?
It's how the process is handled. There are several other models we could use. In some other jurisdictions, what they do is that they elect what they call a broad-based constituent or constitutional assembly. Sometimes they call it a convention, right? So you could actually, what they could have actually done is to say, we are going to have, I don't know, a 70-person constitutional convention. Here are the sectors that we think need to be represented. And actually, what they actually do in some other jurisdictions, they actually have an election for that assembly or convention. So we could have done that. But if we were going with the model we went with, right, there could have been much more consultation as to the membership of that constitutional reform committee than there was.
But we have individuals on it, renowned lawyer, for example, constitutional lawyer, Barnett.
It's actually one of the. Let me say this. I know Dr. Barnett. I have the greatest amount of respect for Dr. Barnett. I did my in-service training before I was a lawyer, the required in-service training when I was at Northern Manley Law School with Dr. Barnett, right? You will find no person who respects few people, I think, respect Dr. Barnett more than I do, right? My reverence for certain constitutional issues comes from the sort of education I was lucky enough to have doing my in-service training with Dr. Barnett. That being said, the committee doesn't need him. The committee doesn't need, I think it's about 14 people, and 11 of them are lawyers. Doesn't need 11 lawyers.
No,
the idea that lawyers have more to say about what should be in a constitution than ordinary people is, to me, one of the most ridiculous things I've heard. You don't think that ordinary people have an idea of what they want, for instance, a Jamaican presidency to look like?
But I'm not thinking that
what makes lawyers so special?
I'm not thinking that that's the issue because before we started in our conversation, you would have disclosed that you were involved in particular aspects of law, but then there are times when you might serve on other areas.
Yes.
So it's not linear, it's iterative. So you being a lawyer, you know, depending on what area you represent.
But 11 out of the 14 are lawyers. Come on.
So, all right, that speaks to a bigger, that clearly now speaks to a bigger issue.
You probably need to have some community organizers on there. You probably need to have people who have, organized, for instance, youth groups and youth outreach. You don't need 11 lawyers.
But there's Nadine Spence on it.
Again, 1 out of 14. 1 out of 14. And I have some disagreements with Dr. Spence. But fine, I'm just saying 11 lawyers.
What would be some of those disagreements with Dr. Spence?
I think she has a different approach to the issue we started talking about, which is emergency powers. And just to go back to that, which is that those of us in the human rights advocacy community are not saying the government ought to do nothing. We are not saying that the situation might not one day require the use of emergency powers. But I think if you say to us that what you need the emergency powers to do is to be able to detain the people, hold them, put the cases together, right? But we actually have an experiment that we can look at. We did that for the better part of 2 years, just the other day. And so you have to ask yourself the question, the government, in order, I think, to be able to again get rolling state of emergency extensions, must show us the results from the last time they had it. How many cases were you able to make when you had these powers for nearly 2 years? How many people were brought before the court? How many convictions did you get? I have to tell you that from a philosophical perspective, somebody like me would still be opposed to the use of these emergency powers outside of what they're prescribed for in the Constitution. And just briefly, what they're prescribed for in the Constitution, they're prescribed for natural disasters, the outbreak of terrible infectious diseases, war, and terrorism. Right? And as I say, crime is terrible and awful in Jamaica. I feel the insecurity just like all other Jamaicans, but it's not any of those things.
So, all right, fine. So pretty much you would assess the government strategy in terms of conveying the urgency of the situation as poor.
No, I think the government strategy is... I don't know if you're talking about their communication strategy, because because I think they've actually been successful with their communication strategy, because they've been so successful that when people like me say this is not an emergency, the average person hears you're saying crime is not a concern. So I think that has been successful. But what I always say to people is, when you ask a person if they support the use of emergency powers and states of emergency, and they say yes, you're doing a poor job in the interview if you leave it at that. Because you see, people are always talking about sacrificing other people's rights. They're never talking about, they're absolutely never ever proposing to sacrifice their rights. So in their minds, they think, yeah man, these powers will only be used against the criminals. Until the police scrape up your son, he's being held without charge. He's gone before the Emergency Powers Tribunal is not being released. And that is when people come seeking out groups like Jamaicans for Justice to assist them.
But following what you have said, don't you think that the Jamaican people are willing to make that sacrifice in an effort to curtail that crime monster?
No, man, me can't make a sacrifice for you.
Why
I can't make a sacrifice for you.
Why not?
No, man, that's not a sacrifice. That's not a sacrifice.
No, because what I'm trying to get at, is whether or not the current level of crime in the country meets the constitutional criteria for an emergency. And how do you interpret this?
No, what I'm saying to you is, and I'll illustrate it by going back to the Everton Douglas case. Justice Morrison looked at the whole thing. And at the end of his judgment, one of his findings was that the situation under which the petitioners were detained did not constitute an emergency within the meaning of the Constitution.
All right, let me pause here for a second as we go to our next break. You're watching The Conversation. We'll be right back. Yes, so just before the break, I remember asking you about whether or not the current level of crime in the country meets the constitutional criteria as an emergency. You were giving us an analogy. Continue. Yeah,
man. No, what I was saying is that, and I would encourage everybody to go and pull down the Everton Douglas case and read what Justice Morrison said. And essentially what Justice Morrison said is that when the Constitution says emergency, right, it means a situation where the organs of the state actually can't function, right? And as bad as crime is, it doesn't fit the legal definition because the organs of the state can function. And what Justice Morrison was getting at was that if you suspect a person has committed a crime, and you want to detain that person, and you want to essentially punish that person for the crime, that person belongs before a court of law, and not an emergency powers tribunal. So you see, that's the crux of the debate about emergency powers. Should we allow the state to be able to detain people without having to charge them with anything? And when you charge somebody with something, it means that it will eventually trigger a trial in which you have to produce and need evidence in order to convict the person. And so the question is, should we allow the state to dispense with all of that, right? in relation to, and I know if you talk to ordinary Jamaicans, they will say, Kenyatta, we are only talking about some people, right? And I always say to them, your comfort comes from the fact that you think you will not be in that category of the some people. And I always say, Jamaicans must be, we must be straight with our people, and we must tell the truth. And it must be put to the Jamaican people. It must be put to the Jamaican people plainly, right? What we are talking about is a system in which basic human rights in the criminal justice system will be suspended, right? And people must be told that when you have that kind of suspension of rights over an extended period of time, it very rarely is limited to just an identifiable group in society. People need to know that they too may be at risk for this. And I think for me, whenever I explain to people that, you know, you could be at risk of being scooped up, sent up in the truck, in lockup for however long without charge. And I have never ever spoken to a person who, after I've said that to them, remained steadfast in their conviction that we need these powers.
So in light of all that you have said, then you're pretty much suggesting that there are specific constitutional safeguards that you believe are to be strictly adhered to, correct? And how can we say the current use of enhanced security measures therefore align with these safeguards?
I don't. It's strictly adhered to part that it's getting me. Because in our constitutional system, and as I say, I'd like to be straight with people. Our constitutional system does allow for the derogation from certain rights, right? And I think that is a logical thing. That's a logical thing for you to have, right? So I'm not saying that there is never a situation in which the state might not be justified in holding a person for an extended period of time without charging them. The problem I'm talking about here, right, is a systemic, widespread use of that kind of power. And what I mean by that is, think about the thousands of people who were detained using these emergency powers, detained and processed, held for 1 month or 2 months or 3 months. When those people come and they come to complain to groups like Jamaicans for Justice and ask for assistance to vindicate their rights, they tell us about the negative impact these things that their detention has had on them. You find people who go into detention, right, who have manageable medical conditions, and those medical conditions become worse as a result of them being detained. You have people who go into detention and they lose their jobs. So we're talking about these powers impacting ordinary people, and a lot of the times people who don't have certain resources to defend themselves. And as I keep saying, it seems to me what a lot of people in Jamaica are saying when they say, I want the government to use these powers. They're saying, I want the government to use these powers and those people over there, not me.
So pretty much is a misunderstanding of the situation that might be causing this kind of reaction.
Yes, and I think as I say, it's coupled with the fact that the government, the state has behaved in such a way as to indicate to people clearly that they need emergency powers to do pretty much anything, right? I kid you not. A state of emergency ends and the police and soldiers disappear. So people form the idea in their head that we need the state of emergency in order to have the police and the soldiers there.
So this last situation that occurred in Salt Spring, St. James, you think that was an emergency? There was a need for the response?
think about the situation that happened in Salt Spring. Two young men, two boys, murdered because somebody, some of the things, maybe somebody put out a hit on another person in the car, all right? You're asking if that's an emergency. If it is an emergency within the meaning of the Constitution of Jamaica, it means that the state can now suspend the rights of certain people suspend the rights of everybody in St. James, because the state of emergency was called for all of St. James, and potentially be able to detain anybody in St. James in relation to this incident. Now, ask yourself this question. Does that sound logical? If the police know who the people are, right, who might be involved in this, then the police they already have the power under normal law to just go and arrest those people, if they know and if they have the evidence. If they don't have the evidence, if they think they know, but they don't have any evidence, all right? All the state of emergency would do would allow them to go and detain who they think it is, right? And you have to say to yourself, but would they need a whole state of emergency for St. James? They don't possibly know where in St. James these people might be, but that's another story for another time.
So you're saying it's uncalled for then?
No, it's uncalled for because I think if the police know and they have the evidence, then what you do is you go and you arrest people, right? And you charge them. The police, and we have to be very clear, the police have the power every day, all day, to arrest you and charge you for things. The only thing that they have to do is eventually they have to present the evidence in a court of law, right, to keep you detained. And I'm saying that if they have the evidence and if they know, they can actually go and arrest the person. And if they don't know, giving them the power, because unless you're saying all the inhabitants of St. James are potentially involved in this incident, I don't know why every single citizen of St. James and anybody traversing St. James must now be subject to the suspension of rights when at most, maybe what? So you have the person who fired the shots, maybe the person who hired that person to fire the shot. What I'm saying is that if the police don't know, they don't have a clue, they don't have any leads, right? I'm saying that situation is not going to be cured by giving them the power to be able to detain anybody in St. James they feel like detaining.
So you think that there's a possibility then that the government might be infringing on the rights, the individual rights there? That's pretty much what you're saying.
We've now had, 2 cases where the courts have already found that. And in the second case, his name is escaping me at the moment, the court ordered damages in the sum of, I believe it was $18 million against the state. So we know that people's rights have been violated. I'm not sure if any of this will allow the police to actually catch the people who are responsible for what happened in Salt Spring.
All right, so with that though, we see the need for public discourse, but how can the public be encouraged to engage in constructive conversations about crime prevention, and what role do you think your organization will play in that?
I think Jamaicans for Justice plays 2 main roles in this, right? I think we have to continue to be a place where people can come and ask us to assist them in vindicating their rights. But I think also that we need to be involved in public education, which the organization is, right? So people must know, for instance, what we mean when we say something isn't an emergency within the meaning of the Constitution. People must, the very discussion we're having now, I think maybe one of the failings is that it probably doesn't happen enough. Because I get some comments, right? I get some comments about people are very angry right? And most often than not, if I take some time when I'm not feeling too cranky, take some time and I explain it, there are some people who will come to an understanding, and we can come to a meeting of the minds. The state has an important role to play in this. I think the state must be in a position to be educating the citizens about their rights and their responsibilities as citizens of Jamaica. I think the state has never done that, right? And it might be wishful thinking to even ask that they start doing that. But I think allowing Jamaicans to have the discussion would start by empowering them with the knowledge and the information that they need to understand the issues.
All right, so we go to our final break. Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching The Conversation. I'm Kwame Thomas. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Conversation, where we have a discussion on matters that affect Jamaica. I'm speaking with Kenyatta Powell, a member or a director rather of the Jamaicans for Justice. So based on all that you have said, I'm sure that there are others who might walk away with the impression that the government it's in their best interest to not educate the people because somehow they are miscommunicating or doing poor communication, well, miscommunicating in terms of what they're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to be doing. And you're pointing to a blatant abuse of their powers. Could we make that assumption, or would you make that assumption, or that statement rather, because that's what many persons might be able to distill from what you have said?
You see, the only part of that I disagree with is the idea that it's a miscommunication. I don't think it's a miscommunication.
So it's deliberate?
I think it's deliberate. And again, I'd like to back up to say I will give the government the grace of believing that in good faith, they really think that they need to have exercise of these emergency powers over a long period of time. So I will give them the grace of assuming that they're not evil mustache twirling villains who just love lock up people, right? I think just listening to some of the politicians, I think some of them genuinely believe, right, that we need to abrogate or abridge certain rights for an extended period of time just to get the crime monster under control, right? What I do think is that in order to pursue that goal, right, they have engaged in a communication strategy that's deliberately concocted, I think, to give people an impression that is not entirely cognizant with the truth or with the reality of the situation.
So are there any alternative approaches that you believe could yield better results to what the government is doing now?
Every time I'm asked this question and I answer, it makes people angry, but I'm going to answer it in the way I've always answered. If you're asking me about what would my solution be to managing the crime issue, all right? I would say that crime in Jamaica is, the crime isn't the disease. The crime is the symptom of serious, deep social problems that we have in Jamaica. And I think the only way we are going to be safer on this island is if we fix those problems. And those problems include poverty. Those problems include massive yawning inequality in Jamaica. Those problems include certain kinds of deprivations that too many Jamaicans are made to endure on a daily basis. So I hear a lot of people asking about, how is it, a lot of Jamaicans don't have patriotic pride anymore, and they don't seem to have bought into, Project Jamaica and that kind of thing. And I always respond to them is that for too many people, this society, this country has left them behind, has not cared for them, right? and they're making their way in the society in the best way they see how. And I think until we have a healthier society, we're not going to get a handle on the crime. So it is, the fix is long term, because the problem, the society that we have now, what I would call the sort of unhealthy society that we have now, it took centuries to get here. And to believe that emergency powers is the thing that's going to get us out of the crime problem, when even after that, people are still going to be insecure, still locked out of certain economic opportunities. I think to believe that we're going to solve crime with these emergency powers is foolhardy.
Well, but you said that it took us centuries to get here. But I don't think that we have the luxury of time to solve that problem. So what kind of tangible measures do you think we perhaps could implement, or we could at least start with now to fix some of those issues?
If you're talking about crime management, we would, again, people are always asking for immediate solutions, and I always have to say, I don't have any immediate solutions, because I don't think the problem is something that can be solved in the short term, right? Okay, but there are things I still think that they can do.
What about the government's Committee for Crime Prevention?
I think the committee, I think we'd be better off if you ask the committee that question. But there are some things I think that can be done. Some things that can be done. So a lot of people don't trust certain systems, right? And a lot of people can't depend on certain systems. So I'm a lawyer, tell you about the court system. We've had this awful backlog in the court system for a while. It's getting much better, right? So if we want people to buy into the judicial system as a good avenue for them to be able to solve their problems, right, we have to actually have more serious investment in that system to make it much more accessible. To people. I hear the government saying that on the next thing I'm about to talk about, that they're doing that. I'm not quite sure. I have my own concerns about that. But basically improving the ability of the police to actually do constabulary work, to actually do investigative work, and to actually do forensic work, and to actually be able to put together cases that can go through the court system. Quickly. But as I say, a lot of the solutions are very long-term, massive investments in education to bring our school system up to a certain level where we don't have educational apartheid, where somebody can be in Campion College, right? And then somebody else who is at Papino.
Or Casey.
Well,
that's it.
Casey is the gold standard.
Okay.
but Kingston College, for instance, somebody can be at Casey, a boy can be at Casey, from the same community, and just across the road where you have Holy Trinity, the educational opportunities and outcomes are a million miles apart. So those are things that I think we have to fix in order to have a healthy society. And once we have a healthy society, we will see less crime. So we have to have massive investments in healthcare, education, and a social welfare system that allows people to be able not just to survive in a society, but to thrive. You cannot tell people to reject crime, right, when those people can't depend on the state in order to provide them with certain opportunities that they can advance themselves.
So is it that you're justifying that crime is a means to an end then? Because you say it's a symptom, and then you're...
Yeah, but I don't know anybody who thinks that that people go into criminality for the fun of it. Do you think that? I don't think that. I don't think anybody thinks that.
No, well, the thing is, you find that when we seek to look at ways to justify what's happening, then you find that it's difficult sometimes for us to find a proper solution.
It's not it's not justification. It is understanding why things happen.
Okay.
So I wouldn't say it's just if it's understanding why things happen. I think informally, most Jamaicans understand, right, that a gunman has a short life expectancy, right? He's either going to be cut down by other gunmen, right, or cut down by the security forces while they're performing their duties, or if not, he's eventually going to end up in prison for a very long time.
So there's no good way out of that.
So there's no good way out of that, right? So you have to ask yourself, why do people go into it anyway? What is it about our society that says to a person who knows all of what you and I know about the life of a gunman to go be a gunman anyway?
So could this be a reaction to the fact that there is a deficit in terms of public trust? That's what you're hinting at.
It's not just that. It's systems and institutions that I think do not serve ordinary people. And if they serve ordinary people, they don't serve ordinary people well, right? So the education system, I think, does not serve ordinary people well, right? So when you tell a person that education is the key to success, but all that person has access to is an underperforming primary school and then an underperforming secondary school, at some point the person gets the message that the system doesn't care about them. So when you see people having trust issues with the system, with official institutions, I think those people have very legitimate reasons for having those trust issues.
Wow. So in light of all that you have said, in light of all the concerns that you have put forward, are there any steps that you would advocate for to ensure accountability as far as security measures are concerned, and as far as transparency are concerned, so that we can address public apprehensions?
Well, what we need is more people out there pushing or organizing and pushing our politicians to pursue policies that do not lean heavily on, violating people's rights. And again, I think that the work on that has to be undertaken by groups like Jamaicans for Justice, because the state isn't going to do it. Let me not say the government, I just said the state. So the state isn't going to do it. So we need to have people educated, informed, organized, right? Because those are the kinds of people who will be able to push the political leaders to pursue other avenues. We need to find ways where there are opportunities to work within the system, despite all the flaws in the system. I think people need to take those opportunities. So more people, I think, because a lot of people, what they do is they have a situation, they have an experience where their rights may have been violated, and they think about it, they're aggrieved, but they say, boy, I have other things to do, right? I'm going to have to pursue this, probably get a lawyer, that kind of thing, right? So we need to give people great opportunity to challenge the state when the state violates their rights. And it might be building out capacity in more organizations like Jamaicans for Justice to take on more cases to advocate, to help people to advocate for their rights. But as I said, all of the things we're talking about, all of it is still about treating symptoms, because I think the problem we have in Jamaica is society-wide, and the crime we're having is just a symptom of the unhealthy society, and we need to get the health of the society to a certain point, and when we get to that point, we'll be able to solve much more of these problems. An education system that works, a healthcare system that actually works, for ordinary people. A natural social welfare system and a social safety net does not leave people out there to, the most vulnerable out there, to have to fend for themselves, right? And have to do all manner of things just to survive. You can easily cut off the oxygen to the various gangs in certain communities if the people have, if the people know that they can actually depend on the state to protect them and to secure their welfare.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Powell. It has been a good conversation with you. There you have it. We have heard a lot of suggestions, a lot of measures that should be implemented from the director, or one of the directors from the Jamaicans for Justice, Kenyatta Powell, attorney at law. I'm Kwame Thomas, and this has been The Conversation.